Yes. Right. So my topic tonight was connected to what we started discussing at the end of last week. After our discussion, we got into a little bit of a discussion on when Judaism allows us to take somebody else's life, and when we can talk about what's the Jewish approach really to euthanasia and assisted suicide. Now, in Victoria, recently it's become legal to a few years ago, a couple of years ago, or maybe it's less than that, around 2 years ago, the law changed to allow for what's called assisted suicide, which means, in my understanding, that if a person gets to a point where they're particularly ill and they have whatever certain levels of pain, and it's written off by several doctors, 2 doctors or 3 doctors, or whatever the exact thing is, that the person terminally ill, then they can prescribe something that will kill the person. Now, this law is also being passed in numerous places around the Western world. I know in New South Wales recently, they tried to, there was one of the Labour ministers over there, tried to propose this law very recently, in recent weeks. I think both the new Premier and the leader of the opposition both said that they would not be for it. They would not vote in favour. But here in Victoria, it was already passed. And what I would like to discuss, and this is going to be, while it's a very heavy subject, I didn't. First of all, I don't have enough knowledge to go really in depth. But I want to just lightly reach the topic, talk about the topic, and visit what we're talking about and what Judaism would say about it. It's very relevant, and not only is it relevant with regards to the law, it's relevant with regards to many other things as well. Sorry. It's regards to how we value our own lives and how we look at life, and how we look at the Jewish version of what we're supposed to be doing here. And it really ties into what we've been discussing the last few weeks, is the source of our morals and ethics, and where they all come from. How do we figure out what's our moral and ethical? And this is really the big question of our times, trying to understand morals and ethics for our times. Because as the world is changing and science progresses, more and more questions of what science is able to do becomes questionable. So this question is, let's try to frame the question in order to make it somewhat more tangible. If you know somebody that is in tremendous pain and suffering, really in agony, and the doctors have said that there's no hope or little hope for that person to ever recover, what would be the Jewish position, or what would be the position on about helping this person die sooner and ending their misery quicker? So, yes, Jochen.
Sorry, I had to say something. My wife was trained as a specialist nurse in palliative care in the UK. She's still lodged with the hospice. She was on the home care team for hospice in the UK. And so we've had a few discussions in relation to end of life in a hospice. And generally at that time, when she was a nurse working in this field, it was to relieve pain, not euthanasia, to die in dignity, as they call it, dying with dignity. Just to cut a long story short, I mean, I discussed euthanasia, and she personally doesn't believe in euthanasia, and I don't either, because I don't think, we should be, it's not our job to take someone's life. It's only Hashem's job. I'm jumping the gun here, maybe. I hope I'm not.
No. Well, you are, but that's okay. I don't want people jumping the gun in this time. Sometimes it's a little bit.
I know,
It's never
but it is.
disruptive to the class. It's always good to see where people are holding.
It's a really contentious subject. I have a Jewish friend in the UK I went to school with. He's not been very well at all, and he's very much for euthanasia. He's a member of the Euthanasia Society. So we had plenty of arguments about it, because obviously I'm come from the other side. But he's not particularly religious, so it's a very much a different ball game.
Right.
Said my piece.
Okay, good. Well, I'm glad you brought that up. So that's just so you've really highlighted how real this and contentious this issue is, and how much it needs to be addressed. So let's look at it firstly from just a somewhat of a secular perspective. If you were a secular individual and not a religious person, how would you look at this question? And there's generally two perspectives on it. And the one perspective on it is, well, you should do just that. If a person is suffering and they're in pain and they don't have much chance or any chance of surviving longer, then it's called a low quality of life. They don't have quality of life, and therefore you would be doing them a favor by putting them out of their misery. And that's just a basic perspective, and that's why people like Dan Andrews, who I think was very pro this type of law, pushed it for those type of things, and they feel that perspective would say we're doing a kindness to people that are suffering, and I would take it a step further, and I'm hoping to return to this if I remember. I didn't write notes this week just because of the lack of time, as I mentioned. But the perspective on we know that with animals, when we have an animal that is suffering and that's unwell, then we would often help by putting them down, as it's called. We'd put them down and put them out of their misery. So if we can do that for animals, then why can't we do it for people? Now, I want to talk about that as well when it comes to with regards to people. But just in case I forget, if someone reminds me, please remind me later to touch on that particular point. So that's the one perspective. The other perspective is this. No, we should not be taking other people's lives. And I'm talking about from a secular perspective, right? From a secular perspective, why would you say no to this question? And the answer would be because it's known as what's called a slippery slope. That means that while you may decide and qualify what is the criteria for when you can take somebody's life today, that can easily be changed in a very short amount of time. So today we can say that, well, if a person is above the age of 85 and they are no longer conscious and or they are just in extreme agony and there's absolutely no point, then we can allow them to have their life or have assisted suicide, euthanasia. But if a person is in any other type of predicament, then we can't do it. But then the next day we can say that we could slightly lower the criteria and say that, well, it's anybody that is of any age, but it's just really not decides that they want to end their life, and that's eventually what has come to in certain places. I don't know if it's Switzerland or some European countries, one of these really Western style countries. We know there was a famous individual, I think he was an Australian, that was a very big, I can't remember the story, but you might remember the story. There was a man who was around 70 years old, and he was one of these, he was like a professor, and he said, he was healthy and he'd lived his life. He said, "Oh, I've lived my life well. I have nothing left to do with my life," and he flew to whatever it was, Switzerland, where it's legal, and over there, doctors did him, so to speak, a favor and ended his life for him in peace. And then he had a nice, quick, and peaceful death. that's the slippery slope of at what point does this change? And then, if we're allowing people to at some point say that, my life is not worth living, then what's the case with suicide, and where does that come in? To say, obviously you would understand from the outset that, of course, I do not agree with the first approach of being allowed to just take your life, or I'm sure you understand that Judaism does not agree with the first approach. The Judaism certainly does agree with the second approach, but not for that reasoning alone. While that reasoning is definitely valid and it's a very good reason, but that's a secular reason. So we'll also, that's what I would say is the logical reason. We're going to talk about what's the Jewish version. They say a story about a man that had reached the age of 75, and he was all doing well, and he's decided that he'd achieved what he wanted to achieve. He didn't want to be a burden on society anymore by living in a retirement village. So he decided that he was going to travel to Switzerland, and over there he would be having an end of the life party, and then on the second day after and the conclusion of the party, he would, the doctors would do him a favor, and they would end his life in a celebratory way. Anyway, he invites all his family and friends, and everyone decides they're going to fly in for this end of life party. A week before the party, he calls his friend and he says, "Listen, I've been having some second thoughts about it. I don't know if I should do it. I'm thinking maybe I do have what to live for. I'm having doubts." And his friend turns to him and says, "How can you do this? Everyone's already booked their tickets. They're all excited and waiting for the party." Yeah. And now I'm hoping that the story is a joke, but unfortunately, when you look at it that perspective, suddenly we see it in a little bit of a different way of looking at it. So there's certainly the way of looking at it which is the merciful and kind approach, which is, well, we're doing the person a favor. The person is suffering, and we're going to put an end to their suffering. But on the other hand, there certainly is the concept of the slippery slope. So that's perhaps a secular approach. Now, what's a religious approach? Now, when I say religious approach, now I'm talking about not necessarily a Jewish approach, but we know, and I think you're aware, that definitely Christianity and Christians, Muslims, other religions are also against this this approach of euthanasia. They're against euthanasia. And what would their approach be? So my understanding is the reason why they oppose assisted suicide is because they say that as long as a person is alive, it's a blessing from God, and we don't want to take away. We don't know what the message, the mission is, and what the blessing is, and what the reason behind it is, and therefore we don't have a right to impinge on that, to go against that. Every moment has to be used and decided. Life is given by God, and we don't have a right to touch it. Now, Judaism would agree with that, but Judaism takes it a step further. So in order to get that, this has all been an introduction to our class. In order to understand this law from a Jewish perspective, as I said, some of the main sources for my class today I didn't find, so I'll tell you them, some of them off by heart, and I'll discuss a few points with you.
Can you look something up in a minute?
Yeah, if you can, just do me a favor and look up Hilchas Goises. If there's, I don't know if it's not a laws of Goises, but there's the laws of end of life from the Rambam, and I thought it was in I think it was by I thought it was in the laws that I'm showing you now, but I couldn't actually find it.
Okay.
Okay, let's just look over here for a second. If you find something on, just looking over here quickly. All right, you see, I was looking not for long enough, but I was looking for a particular source. There's a few chapters that talk about end of life scenarios where we talk about what happens to people at the end of their lives and close to the end of their life. But let's first look at the source of the laws of murder. You look at the source of murder. It says Kol ha'hereg chaveru b'yadeh. Anybody that kills a person with his hands, whether he does it with a sword or with a stone, or he strangles him or he burns him, in any way the person dies, harei ze nerag b'beis. So that's the penalty, the punishment for murder is death penalty. Okay, so let's just go and look at the Torah source for this. So the Torah source is actually in Bereshit. Shofech dam ha'adam, dama yishpoch. Let's look over here. Sorry, I actually have this open elsewhere. Okay, so if you look over here, it says over here, when it's talking about animals, and this is going to help us understand the question that I had before, what's the story with animals? Are we allowed to kill animals? And the answer was that till the time of Noah, we were not allowed to eat animals. We're not allowed to kill animals even. We certainly were not allowed to eat animals. But from the time of Noah, after the flood, Hashem says that from now people are allowed to eat animals. So in the time of Adam in Bereshit, it tells us that people are not allowed to eat animals. But that changes, and we're not going to get to it why, and that this is the legality, so to speak, of not being vegetarian, because we're allowed to eat animals. But when it talks about but the flesh with its soul, we're not allowed to eat the blood of an animal, and then it talks about killing man. It says, "Shofech dam adam, ba'adam damo yishapech." If you kill the blood of you, if you spill the blood of man, he's got the death penalty. Why? Why is it different when it comes to humans as opposed to animals? Ki b'tselem Elokim asayit adam, because man was made in the image of God. And then he goes on to say, and furthermore, you should go and multiply puruvu, and that's where we have once again that message to be fruitful and multiply. So the source of not killing is one. The Torah doesn't differentiate between whether or not the person is suffering or not. The Torah says clearly that you're not allowed to kill another person, and it also says that if you do so, domo yishpach, that there's a death penalty for doing so. Now, and it also says, umiyad, if you look at the pasuk beforehand, v'aches timchon, but your blood, l'nafsho teichem, I will demand, edrosh miyad kol chayat rishenu, miyad adam, if any person, miyad ish, if a person kills another, I will demand his soul from that man, telling us also once again that we're not allowed to kill a person. So immediately that concept that I mentioned before, that the reason why you're allowed to kill from a Jewish perspective, it's very simple. Why are we not allowed to murder? Because the Torah says that you're created in the image of God, you're not allowed to kill another person. How come? What happens if the person is struggling and suffering? Well, the fact that you can do it to an animal is not a proof. Why? Because the Torah does allow us to at times take the life of an animal. Of course, it doesn't mean we should just go hunting for the sake of things. The reason you're not allowed to just go and hunt is because that's what we call bal tashchis. It's actually wasteful to kill for no benefit. But if you're killing because the animal is suffering or because it's for human consumption, and we've spoken about in previous time, and the Torah sees it as actually as something which is beneficial to humans, and it's allowed. Okay, I don't want to get into that, but that answers that question. Now, so in short and in summary, we can cut this, the whole shir over here, but I'll go further a bit. But we could cut the shir over here and say why are we against assisted suicide, euthanasia? And the answer is, hi Leon and Irene, good to see you. The reason why we're against assisted suicide is for a very simple reason, because we say that our life is not owned by us. We don't own our own life. Our life is owned by God. Our body is owned by Hashem. And therefore, we don't have a right to go and take our own life. It's not ours to take. So let me give you an example of what I mean. If you're, I heard this example from another rabbi, which I thought was a cute example. If your neighbor comes to you and says, listen, I'm going away on a holiday for a week. I need somebody to watch my dog. Could you please look after my dog for me? And you take the dog and you look after the dog, but the second night, the dog keeps you up all night and barking and making all types of noise. And you get fed up with it. So can you go and say, you know what, I'm fed up with this dog, I'm just going to shoot him? No. Why can't you do that? Because it's not your dog to kill. You don't have the right to kill it. Now, what happens if the owner wanted to do that? That would be a sick thing. But if somebody kills their own animal, I don't know what the law is, but it's different to killing somebody else's thing. Why? Because it's not your thing. So what we're saying is, your life or any human being's life is not in our hands to be able to go and say, well, we want to end that life. It's not our life to decide. We don't have ownership over life. Now, why is this this is a revolutionary concept, even compared to other religions? Because within secular society, the concept or the understanding is that we have ownership of our own lives. We own our bodies, we own our souls, and we own ourselves, and therefore we have the right to decide what happens to our bodies. Now, we know that in Judaism, we're not allowed to make a tattoo on our body, right? Why are we not allowed to make a tattoo on our body? Because it's not our body to make a tattoo. The Torah says, don't desecrate your body. What happens if you wanted to cut your body? You're not allowed to do damage to your body, purposeful damage to your body, because it's not yours to do that to. And as a matter of fact, it says, we're actually obligated to take care of the body. In other words, what Judaism is saying is as follows. We are souls. We are our souls. That's who we are. And for a certain amount of time, your soul is placed in a body, and your job is to keep that body alive and healthy. And that's the obligation to keep healthy, that you have to protect your life. Doing any type of damage to our lives, to our bodies, is forbidden, and including and especially taking another soul. Why? Because it's not yours to take. It's not you. You don't have the right to decide what we do with our bodies. And that's what, by the way, this answers us. This gives us an understanding to another concept, which we'll talk about another time, is why Judaism is. So, just to recap before I get into this point, the reason why we're not allowed to kill another person, and it doesn't make a difference, is because the Torah clearly says, do not murder. You're not allowed to kill. And if you do, there's a death penalty for murder. That's the reason why. But the reason behind that, what's the Torah's reading? It's not a chok, it's not a reason we don't understand. It's because you don't own your body. Nobody owns their right, and no, you don't have the right to go and take somebody else's body. Now, what happens if I wanted to commit to kill myself, to commit suicide? I'm not allowed to. Why? Because I don't own the right over my own body. It's not my right. It's not my body to kill. And if it's not my body to do damage to hurt, to tattoo, etc., etc. By the way, there's a misconception of people think that people that have got a tattoo don't get buried in a Jewish cemetery. That's not true. It's against the Torah. It's two separate laws. Don't mix them. It's against the Torah to desecrate the body, including making a tattoo. Then the Torah actually clearly writes a tattoo. But it doesn't mean that if a Jewish person passes away because they're a tattoo, they can't be buried in a Jewish spot. They certainly in a Jewish cemetery. They certainly can. The law is you cannot desecrate your body. Now the same thing applies to why it's against the Torah. The Torah says that what do we have to do with your body once you pass away? What you actually have to do with your body once you pass away is you have to return it to God. Your body has to return to God. How do you do it? It says, the Torah says that me'afar ba or me'afar tashuv. You came from the ground and you should return to the ground. God created you from the dust and you return to the dust. And that's what we say, why it's almost, so to speak, our way of giving our bodies back to God. Now, I don't want to get into cremation because we'll talk about cremation and burial at a different time, but just know that it's considered an extremely important concept. So let's look at this for, you know what, I'll pause for a moment and just ask if anybody has any questions. No?
Lots and lots and lots, but that's okay. It's a complex topic.
Okay.
So
hang on. What I was going to ask, so maybe it's the wrong time to ask the question, but what do we call it when you get burnt?
What do you mean?
Instead of being buried when you die,
You
get
cremated.
cremated.
But that's against the law as
So,
well, Jewish law.
but there's a lot of different groups that do cremate, but also I noticed in the Jewish religion too that we've got a percentage of people that do cremate as well. So
Yeah.
what is the emphasis on that
What's the explanation?
explanation?
So the answer to that would be that it's definitely not an Orthodox Judaism. In other words, it's not real Judaism that's doing cremation, certainly not. And I do believe that even within progressive Judaism, most progressive Jews that are, so to speak, involved within a progressive community would not encourage it. At least most, unless it's, you know, progressive Judaism does not necessarily have set values. It's progressive Judaism kind of has, it's like pick and choose. Each rabbi, so to speak, chooses their own values and choices to make. So it's not based on any major principles. But I think that a broader, but in simple answer to you, it's not within the framework of Judaism. Just because somebody says that they're a Jewish organization, if they're not basing themselves on Torah law, then they certainly are not a representation of the actual Torah or the actual Judaism. So it's certainly against Jewish law to be cremated. 100%. It's not just against, it's considered extremely severe. And we could get into that topic. I don't want to get totally derailed by that topic. I just wanted to explain the reasoning behind that topic is the same reasoning as behind this topic. The reasoning behind not being cremated is the same reason, but it is a topic in of itself, which we can maybe talk about next week. You know, we could talk about cremation next week and burial, but I don't want to get totally derailed. But I hope that I'll answer that question because I want to make it very clear. It's 100% against Jewish law to be cremated, and not only is it against, it's considered a severe problem. And that's where we as rabbis will go out of our way to try to encourage people not to be cremated. Okay. No, we'll go to extreme lengths just to say that.
May I add to what you've just said, Rabbi, that not only that, but there's in the secular world, there's huge movements at the moment about ecological burial, about environmentally sound burial. And what they mean by that is returning the components of the person fully back to the earth where it originated. And they don't realize this, but when you look at the practices that they follow in terms of the shrouding, the type of coffin that's permitted, or the decomposition process, they approach it scientifically, but they end up essentially copying exactly what Judaism does, Orthodox Judaism. And the goal, from their point of view, they don't see it as spiritual, they see it as fully returning the shell, the body, back to the earth from which it originated. And cremation interferes with that process.
Yeah. I did once see an article from a progressive congregation where they said, while we do offer cremation, we want people to understand that it is not environmentally friendly. It's actually more environmentally friendly to to bury, and also they go through, you know, the costs is almost similar in costs, and there's ways of doing burial cheaper and things like that. So so people shouldn't be turned off by the cost or by the concept of it being more environmentally friendly. So this was from a progressive community that did actually do it. But once again, that certainly is not the very fact that we wouldn't go near such a thing. Okay, Joe, what was your question?
Oh, so many. I mean, it's obviously a serious.
I just think of one or
topic.
two because I want to just go a little bit further and we'll have a little bit more time later on.
Well, I guess there's the whole thing around palliative care, because that's where we run into a lot of problems. Is it's all good in theory, but as Yochanan said, is that when you're confronting when you're aware of a real life situation, and I've been through many of those myself, suddenly the academic side becomes very real. So the issue then, knowing when the transition happens into palliative, so even knowing where that border is, where is the person in that end of life stage? They may think they are, but they're not. So who judges end of life is one of the topics. And then what's permitted during that palliative care stage from a Jewish perspective. And there's probably several years worth of shiurim just in those topics.
Yes, you're correct. You're correct. And I wanted to say that the source that I'm looking for touches exactly on this topic, because this is really the second part of our discussion. Understanding what major extremes we go to, or what is considered actually euthanasia and assisted suicide and all those things. I see that Yochanan, you unmuted yourself.
I was just going to mention that because I've heard my wife working in palliative care herself, and she does not believe in euthanasia. I have to say that, but her job was to die with people who are dying of, say, cancer, whatever, to die with dignity. They're in pain, so they get drugs, so they don't have that pain. But they're not trying to kill them. But sometimes, because the drugs are quite strong, maybe that possibly could shorten their life. But then it's not intentional.
Okay.
Does that make sense?
So I want to touch on what you're talking about, and I think what Joe and you are talking about is on the same topic, and that's the direction it's going to go. So in Jewish law, there's a law called a goises. A goises is a person that is literally on what I think in English term would be on his death throes. Death throes is his end of his life, and he doesn't have long to live. So it's that time of a person's life where, you know, the doctors call in and say, come now, you know, that he's going to go soon. He or she's going to go soon. Now, there's a few chapters within Jewish law in Maimonides that he goes into, which I was hoping to show, but I just couldn't find the place. Just never had time to find it. Where he goes into describing how strict these laws are, and he talks about if a person is in that predicament, you're not even allowed to. If you're not allowed to touch the person, if you feel like if the touching could in some way hasten the person's death, or you're not supposed to even leave go of the person if leaving go. The Torah says that the halacha says you're not supposed to leave a person's room if a person is dying. Now, obviously, it goes into say if you do these things unintentionally, for example, if you touch the person and that unintentionally causes the person to die, then that's not considered murder. So let me just break for a moment from this and give you another law. There's a law in Torah that if you have somebody that, let's say, pushes another person off a building, and they push the person off a high building, and you have another person, and sorry for being gruesome in this particular example, and you have another person that sees the person falling from the building and knows that by the time the person falls, when the person hits the ground, the person is going to die on as soon as he lands. And thank you, Noah.
That's what you're talking about right now, about the person pushing him off the building. Number 7.
Yeah, thank you. I'm going to open it in a second.
I'm just going through lots of files to get to the right one, the Shogeg with the Gosses. But regarding the building, this is the one. Number 7. וכן הדוחף את חברו מראש הגג ונפל ומת.
Okay, I'll talk about this one, but I actually okay, this is not exactly the law I was going to get into because I was going to do something else.
Okay.
But it's connected to what we've got, and I see for some reason the translation over here is into Dutch.
Yeah, I don't know why. Okay.
You gave me the Dutch
I was
version.
just reading the Hebrew. I wasn't looking at the translation.
Okay, that's fine. I'll open it in a second. But that was the same chapter that we were the same law that we want to. I'll give you the example outside either way. But thanks for that. So it says over there, if you this is, I don't think, an example in Rambam, but the law is, let's say somebody pushes somebody off a 10-story building. 10-story building, the person falls off a 10-story building, has a very, very small chance of survival, almost a zero chance of survival. And somebody sees the person falling from the building, takes a gun and shoots the person in the head, and causes the person to die before the person hits the ground. Now, how long did he make the person's shorten the person's life by? Who's guilty? Who's a guilty person over here? Is it the person that made the person that pushed the person off, or is it the person that killed that shot him? Because you can say that you know, what's your opinion? So the Judaism says that they both had intentions to kill the person. And now let's say the first person said, well, I see this person was going to fall. Sorry, the second person. So I saw he was going to fall and he was going to die. So I thought, let me just take him out of his agony and shoot him straight away. So the Torah tells us, the halacha says, that person is also guilty. Why? Because even though the person was going to die in any case, but he shortened his life by those few seconds, and therefore he's also guilty. Because every second that you hasten a person's life, that you hasten a person's death, is guilty. So going back to our example, our other topic, why does Judaism care if a person is about to die? How can you, a person's going to die in any case. So if you make a person die 1 hour earlier, or 10 minutes earlier, or even 1 second earlier, what's wrong with that? And the answer says, so Judaism, the Torah says no. Because every single moment in Jewish life is considered, we are not allowed to differentiate between one type of person that's alive and another person that's alive. So if a person is very sick and in a tremendous amount of pain, or a person is falling off a building but they're healthy, but they're going to die in a second later, or a person is got mental health issues and they're really suffering from those issues, or if a person has just decided that they lived out their life and now they want to, it doesn't make a difference to Judaism. All those people, or the person is 110 years old and is literally about to die and they've just lived a good and healthy life, and you just shake them a little bit and cause them to die a day earlier, it doesn't make a difference. In all those cases, the person is considered a murderer. Why? Because taking a life is a life. The Torah doesn't differentiate. We don't have the authority and the ability to differentiate between one life and the other. If there's any chance or any way that we consider that person to be alive, in Judaism, we only differentiate between two things. Is the person alive or not? It's not about how alive is he, or what percentage dead is he, or what chances does he have of survival. In Judaism, it's all about one thing: is the person alive? And therefore, it goes through chapters and chapters on category laws and laws of end of life, and how people that have somehow caused a person to die any sooner than they were supposed to ends up being considered a murder. Now, what's the understanding of this concept? The reason behind it, as we mentioned earlier, two reasons. Number one, because Judaism, looks at life as something which is not in our hands to take away from anybody else. We don't have the right to murder somebody. And therefore, we don't have the right to decide between any individual, no matter what the case is. Now, we may think of the slippery slope example as being foreign, but we've seen already yeah, we'll talk about organ donation maybe another time because it's very related to this, but it's a whole chapter in and of itself, because organ donation can have exceptions, can be the exception to the rule at times, and there's a whole different category of fish when we talk about organ donation. So I don't want to get into that topic tonight. We have an obligation to keep a person alive as long as they are breathing. But the question becomes like this: if the person is, so let's say a person is on a respirator and they're not breathing by themselves, and they need, they're only breathing through a machine. Am I allowed to take them off that machine if they're not living by themselves, they're alive, but what's keeping them alive is a respirator? Am I allowed to take them off the machine? What's the answer?
No.
No. Okay. So how do we prevent cases of people going onto respirators and not staying there and just having their heart, their blood being pumped and their heart beating for the next 20 years just because the respirator is keeping them alive? How do we prevent that from happening?
Yeah, it is. I mean, excuse me interrupting there. They have ways of checking if the person is brain dead or they're not actually alive.
Okay, so they do have ways of checking. But sometimes
it's not your job. It's not your job. Your job just to keep him alive.
okay.
Yeah.
But
I mean,
the question becomes like this: from a Jewish perspective, sometimes they had a case. So there's this case is a common. It happens, unfortunately. It's not. I wouldn't say it's common, but it happens. It happens several times, and I spoke about it last week. Recently, about a case in England about a young girl that had a very difficult life in age of 2, and the parents kept her on life support machinery, and the hospital in England wanted to take her off it, and they said no, and they took it to court, and the court said no, sorry, you're using up government funds and whatever, and then they got the organizations both from Israel and America that were willing to take her overseas and take care of her there, so it wouldn't be, and they said no. Why do they say no? Because you're prolonging her suffering. And this girl was taken off her life support, and she died. And this was a girl from religious background, because the secular courts said that. Now, what's the problem with this? What's the problem with that case? The problem with this case is that when we look at all these cases of life support and end of life situations, we're always looking at it from people, everyone looks at it from the prism of how they understand what is moral and what is true and how we look at life. So the judge in that particular case, their understanding was that it's my obligation to do the moral thing. And if I see somebody suffering, I have to put them out of their misery. And therefore, my look in life is this person suffering? And if I see the person is being suffering, therefore I have to say, no, you can't prolong their suffering. So here's the thing about Judaism. Judaism says like this, and this is where we're going to answer part of Joe's question and Yochanan's question. If you see a person that is suffering and they're having a lot of pain, are you allowed to give painkiller even though it may hasten their death? And Judaism would say, what's your intention? Is your intention to get to kill them quicker, or is your intention to take away the pain? If your intention is to lessen the pain, you can give generally more morphine or any other pain reliever. Generally, that's okay, as long as you don't intentionally try to hasten their death through that. Okay. And when you come to a case of, for example, someone that's on a respirator, life support machine. So the Tzitz Eliezer, who was the head rabbi of, I think it was Tzedek Hospital, one of the biggest hospitals in Israel, and he was one of the great poskim, great halachic rulers in the previous generation. Passed away a few years ago, and he rules on a lot of these subjects, as do many others. Not everyone always agrees with him, but he gave an example of a situation where there was somebody that they said that if this person went into life support, the person may be stuck on life support for a while. And there'll be no way halachically you wouldn't be able to turn on the life support. So you have a choice of, you can keep the person, you can save the life by putting the person on life support, but then the person might not be able to ever go off the life support. And the person may just be, so to speak, dead in a certain way, or not being conscious and just living off the life support and not ever start breathing and living again on their own. And as long as you keep the life support on, they will keep on living. So should we put them on the life support in the first place? So what's the law? Generally, Torah law is as follows. We are supposed to generally do everything we can do to save a life. That's Jewish law. However, we don't have to, if somebody is really in pain and suffering, we don't have to give them all the medication that they need if that medication only will do, all the medication will do will be prolonging their suffering. So there's other ways of how, if a person is, there's a difference. So basically what the Judaism differentiates between is by prolonging life, even though the person's in tremendous pain, as opposed to murder. What's the difference? If somebody is on a respirator and you pull out the plug, the Torah would say that's murder. That's tantamount to murder because you're killing them. That's active killing. If your person is unwell and you give them a drug which will kill them, that is murder. But if a person is not yet on a respirator and you're concerned that the respirator will just continue and prolong their suffering, do you have to put them on the respirator in the first place? So if you don't put them on the respirator, they will die. And if you do put them on the respirator, you could be caught in a situation where the person is just living, but with barely being conscious or anything like that, or having any really vital life. And they're just kept alive by a machine. So he came with one particular case. If a person is conscious and they're going to be connected to the machine, he says in certain cases where they think that they can possibly, by being on the respirator, they can get the heart to start pumping again, but they just need that extra boost. So he said that what you can do is you can put the person on a respirator with a timer. And the timer is set before the person goes on it. And then if the time is ticking away and it comes towards the end of the amount of time you've allotted for that person, it says 24 hours, and you see there's been no improvement, then you just leave it. And the machine will go off by itself and you haven't committed murder because you didn't do anything. But if you see that the person is actually doing better and is actually improvement, then you can extend the time for another few days. And once again, so this was his way around it. Did all the rabbis agree with him? I'm not sure. I think there were some rabbis that didn't like that approach. But that was one approach which I think was accepted by the chief rabbinate in Israel and was done in certain cases in Israel. But what you're seeing is here is a major difference between if you're sustaining life or whether you're prolonging life or you're saving a life. The difference is all these laws. Anything to do with actively murdering a person, whether it's giving an injection or turning off a machine, is definitely forbidden in all cases, no matter what.
Rabbi, the update to that, and it's quite relevant in the times of COVID right now, is even here in Melbourne, is that some patients deteriorate enough that they end up not just ventilated, not just artificial coma, but they deteriorate further and they need to be put on something called ECMO. ECMO is where they're attached to an external machine, which both it oxygenates their blood and maintains their vital signs. So for a while, their body is kept alive by an external machine. We have that equipment in Melbourne. It's operating right now. And so that dilemma you described is current and real, but they don't use that timer, not consciously using that timer concept, because I think that would still be considered quite immoral. But you're right that there is still a need.
When it comes to a certain point, the person's just been sitting on that machine.
There have been cases where people have been on machines for years. Yeah. And in fact, even in Australia, there have been people on machines for several months. But the time limit is where the process of being on ECMO itself deteriorates the body. So ECMO is not neutral, it's harmful. And the longer someone is on such a machine, the lesser the chances they'll come out of it.
Right. Okay. So this is the I don't know exact details of how all these machines work, etc. But I'm just giving the general outlines that shows where the line will be drawn within Jewish practice when it comes to allowing for assisted suicide to happen, is in the sense that it doesn't ever allow for assisted suicide, but it will allow for people to stop giving medicine, for example. You don't have to do all the medicine, all the medication. So there are some cases where a person is considered to be suffering, terminally ill, not having long to live. And by giving them more medication, it will simply just add to the prolonging of their life and suffering. Are you obligated to do it? And there the Torah would say you're not obligated to give that medication. You don't have to give the medication. Just because you have it doesn't mean you have to give it. So that would be a differentiation where we're seeing that you're not killing them by not, it's called shev ve'al tasa. You're sitting and you're not doing anything. There's no action involved in that. As soon as there's an action involved in hastening the death, that's when it becomes a problem. Okay.
There is another example, again, I may share, quite contemporary, is in a few months we'll have access to a medication called molnupiravir for COVID. And molnupiravir is an oral tablet, 5 days, a couple of doses a day, end of story. Most people will recover quite happily. But like any medication, it carries a risk of side effects if used for a long time. And one of those risks with extended use of that drug is could be significant increased risk of cancer. So, by giving the drug, there's a little risk of future problems. On the other hand, in the immediate term, the drug will probably save that person's life. So is that sort of risk-benefit analysis?
Yeah, but that's 100% okay from a Jewish perspective, from my understanding. Every single medication is always going to be a risk-benefit analysis that you're going to have to go through. But when you were talking about, if you would talk about, let's say you were putting somebody on some type of medication that could just make them live and live in pain for a long time, and never come out of it, that's a different question. That would be a different situation.
One more immediate example with basic CPR, with resuscitation. If someone collapses and we start compressions, there's a significant risk that we will break a rib.
Wow.
Now, so we're trying to save their life, but the broken rib may pierce the heart. So there's a risk in that procedure, and only a small percentage survive. But my understanding is that Jewish law still obligates us to make the attempt, even in spite of that risk.
Right, 100%. When you're talking about that you're just going to be saving a life, whenever there's just a risk involved, the answer is yes, you're obligated to do whatever you can to help save a life, even if there's a risk, 100%. Even if there's a risk to the person's health. Where the question becomes is when there's not the risk is not that there's a risk to the person surviving and therefore you're going to, the question is that by giving the medication, the person will survive longer but just survive in pain and will never really come out. It's not going to, doesn't have much, it doesn't have any benefit to the person. The person's not going to recover from it. The question then is, are you obligated to give that medication? And then the answer would be no. Okay, so it's a different situation. So I'll just conclude with one last thought, and then if anybody has any final questions, we'll go take it over there. So to be honest, I've just touched on the subject, and I want to just give a few examples and just give you an outline of the subject in general. Torah law goes into much detail, and there's lots of what we call shilas and shuvas, which responses written by rabbis throughout the ages, and particularly more lately with all the advances in technology on the approach to this. So we understand two things, or one thing in particular that I want to highlight in this whole discussion. Judaism values the concept life of a person at every single stage, no matter where a person is in his life. So if a person is at the end of their life and is not even conscious, according to Judaism, that person, that is a valuable life. And we're not allowed to even end it a second early. Even 1 second early is tantamount to murder. The same thing is when it comes to the way we appreciate a life of a person that's at any stage. Judaism says that every single stage that a person is alive is meaningful, and has a purpose and a mission to it. And there's something that that person can achieve. Sometimes people achieve things whether they know it or not, consciously or unconsciously. And I'm talking about not just consciously, unconsciously. Even when a person is unconscious, sometimes Judaism says that person could have a role and a mission within the world. Not sometimes, always. The person always has a role and a mission within the world. No matter at one stage, where the person could be retired and feels like they're just a couch potato, or they could feel like they're a headache to society. They're just causing strain to their families. It doesn't make a difference. Judaism says that at any point in a person's life where they are alive, they have a purpose and a meaning to their life, and therefore they should never take it for granted. And we as individuals have no right to decide whose life is worth more than others. And that's why when we come to almost all cases, Judaism will say that when you save a life, no matter what that stage that life is, you have saved the world. And to take a life, no matter what stage of life is considered murder, because every single stage of life is full of meaning and possibilities. Okay, so with that, I conclude the formal part of tonight's share. And if anybody wants to ask any further questions, please go ahead.
Can I just ask the attitude of Judaism in relation to someone in a hospice situation, but in other situations where they're very sick, and they sign a form to the effect that they do not want to be, if they have a heart attack, for instance, they don't want to be resuscitated. That's the actual patient. How is that looked upon in the Jewish context?
I did once look into this, and I don't remember exactly, but I think off the top of my head, I don't want to give a proper answer, so please don't take what I'm saying as rule. Do not resuscitate. What's it called? Do not resuscitate. Command, or what is it? Do not resuscitate is a word that I'm looking for.
Yeah, form.
It's a directive.
Directive.
It's advanced care directive.
Yeah. I think that in certain cases it is it could be okay, but I don't think that there's a single approach to it, and I think it would depend once again within what's the person's chance of survival, and would we have the obligation to do to resuscitate the person? So the question would fall into the category of, does the person have the right to decide whether or not they should be resuscitated? So is that even within the person's right to decide that? And the answer is not something I've looked into recently. I gave a share on a similar topic a long time ago. It was part of a JLI course I gave, and I've totally gone blank on what the conclusion was. So I'm very apprehensive to give a proper conclusive answer on it. Okay, I'll have to look into it.
Sure, now I understand it's complicated. Thank you.
Yeah, because on the one hand, I'm a little bit torn. On the one hand, I'm thinking that it could fall into the category of it, it's not active murder. But on the other hand, we do have an obligation to try to do whatever we can to save a life. So yeah, I have to look further into it.
Thank you.
Yes,
We've got a friend who's so unwell. She's got that in her directive, that if she does, whatever, if she passes out or whatever, it says do not resuscitate, just let her go. Yes.
This is a Jewish person too.
She's Jewish, yes.
Right.
Yes.
As I said, I'm not sure if that's against Jewish law. I'm not 100%
Yeah.
sure.
And
I'm
in
not.
terms of-
I'm not about to tell her anything.
No,
because
I wouldn't start.
She's suffered so many years.
I'm not sure what he was just asking, whether in general a person is allowed to put that in a end of life will.
She has.
They are allowed to.
Uh,
The legislation varies state by state in Australia, but there are special forms for
I'm talking
DNR.
what we're talking about from a Jewish perspective.
Yep, understood.
Yeah. So yeah, the question from a Jewish perspective: are you allowed to do that? I would think that, just on a superficial outlook, that it would definitely not be ideal, but I don't know if it's 100% against the law. So I don't know if it's as clear as anything to do with, when we're going to talk about organ donation and things like that, then things become, in certain areas, very gray, and in certain areas, very black and white. And it's much more clear than that. And in general, when it comes to doing something which is actively killing a person, that's black and white. It's clearly no. Right? This is about what I said. It could be that it falls into the category of not administering medication to a person that is unwell and is suffering. Then it could fit into that category. And therefore you would say that it's allowed. When the person is suffering, you're not obligated to go and resuscitate them. It could be. That's what I think, but I may be wrong. Okay. Okay, any other last questions?
Well, I was just going to say, my father, a devout communist, sorry, he was at the age of 83, he was told, or 82 maybe, he was told he needed to have whether it was a bypass operation or a valve in the heart, had to be repaired. And he chose not to have the operation. And within 6 months, he passed away. Yet, if we could have overridden his decision, he probably would have been alive for another 10 years because he had a very strong constitution, but he had this problem with the valve in the heart. So he chose, but ironically, my mother passed away 2 years before that.
And he didn't want to live.
He decided he didn't want to continue living for much longer. He wasn't very happy. They had a long marriage relationship. And so he chose to go. Whereas with my mother, she actually wasn't very strong. She fell over in hospital. She fractured some ribs, but she was suffering from cancer and a few other things. Anyway, so she passed away in pain, especially after she fractured the rib. And I said to the hospital, why are you allowing this person to suffer? And they said, we've given her the maximum we're allowed for painkillers or whatever the stuff is, but morphine, that's right. They said, we're giving her the maximum morphine and we're not allowed to give her any more. So she died a miserable death, over a painful death over the next 2 weeks. But I've got two different situations where both have died in different ways, but hence the system allowed it.
Right, that's an interesting point. Will Judaism allow you to up the dose of morphine if a person is really in pain and that person doesn't have long to live? If it's to actually to reduce the pain, sometimes Judaism would say that even though the hospital could have particular laws and how much they're allowed to give, because it could be harmful to give more than that, then sometimes Judaism would say, well, right now your focus is on reducing pain, and sometimes it would say that your obligation would be to up the dose, so to speak. But all these questions, by the way, we're just talking on a very superficial level, and all these questions will have to go to real authorities in this area to discuss all these underlying, because they're big questions, and every situation is very different from another. A guy like Rabbi Fight 11 deals a lot with these type of questions in Melbourne, and he's a specialist in these areas. He was the previous rabbi of Brighton Shore, and he's a real scholar. So those are the type of questions that you would pose to a expert in the field from a Jewish perspective, and you'd ask them to do it. And once again, it comes back to the question of what's our moral base. Is our moral standards coming from Torah and Judaism, understanding that this is the major difference, which I started off with, is the secular perspective is, well, life is there to be enjoyed and to have a quality, and we have our rights, etc. And therefore, when we don't have any enjoyment left in life, then we should end it. Like, what's the point of living anymore? And Judaism has a totally different perspective. And our thing is that your life belongs to a higher power, to God, and you don't have a choice whether or not to live or not to live. And if you can do something to save a life or to help a life, generally you're obligated to. But are you obligated to prolong a life that is suffering? Not necessarily. Okay, as a matter of fact, sometimes we would even pray. The Torah law even allows us to. There's another topic which I didn't have time to get into, is whether we're allowed to pray for someone that is suffering, to help them, pray that their life should end. So we're never allowed to actively murder someone, that's clear. Can you pray? And the answer is yes. People have prayed for their own life. Eliyahu, Elijah the prophet, Jonah the prophet, Jonah. These people prayed that God should take their life. So you can never kill yourself, you can never kill somebody else, but you can pray for God to take your life. That's a separate concept. Okay, so it's just interesting to be mindful of that as well. Yeah.
But Rabbi, can I add on the subject of pain management as well, as being one of the drivers of wanting, like euthanasia or assisted, is that pain, of course, is real, but it's usually a combination of physical and psychological pain. And the pain medication alone is not the only way to manage it. And people's self-perception of pain, if you ask them, out of 10, how do you rate your pain? 1, 2, 3, 5, 10, that their own rating of their own pain will vary depending on what else is happening. The sensation of pain is an interpretation done by your own brain, and that can change. It's subject to further interpretation. And that's why I'm very suspicious of relying on a pain rating alone as a driver for the euthanasia.
Right, I hear you. And I think Judaism perhaps would agree with that. Although at the end of the day, we don't. I think that pain relief is something which is, if a person is suffering and terminally ill, it's something which is not necessarily held back, even though it could be actively causing speeding up death. Once again, because the intention is not there to kill, but to relieve pain.
Yeah. May I give you an example, an alternative? Like most people think of morphine medications, etc., but pain only is transmitted back to the brain through nerves. And so there are actual surgical procedures where the nerves can be severed to stop the pain. Now, it's not necessarily a reversible process, but if someone is dying and it's pretty clear, they may not need those nerves rejoined in the future. Right. So that's, one of those ethical decisions. Can you sever the nerves to stop the pain for sure, or mostly for sure. But that will affect the person's future quality of life unless they're, very close to death, in which case it doesn't matter. So
I hear you. Okay, it's an interesting question. I don't know the answer to that. Okay, I think we're going to start calling a night over here, unless we have any other further points.
Thank you very much. The other point you want to get back to from the beginning, something to do with.
I did touch it. I did kind of get back onto it earlier, which I just wanted to compare the point of what the secular approach of those which are pro taking euthanasia and assisted suicide. They said, well, if we can do it for animals, then we should be allowed to do it for people. And when we looked at the Psukim, we saw clearly when it talks about murder, it says that murder for animals is at times allowed, but for human beings it's not. And that's why you can't differentiate that different. And when we talk about who's created in the image of God, we said that a human is created in the image of God, but not an animal. While we might love our animals more than we love humans, that's sometimes a human tendency and understood, especially if humans are particularly annoying to you. But nevertheless, the law remains that it's far less of a crime to kill an animal than it is to kill a person. And that's because human life, by the way, when it comes to, on that topic, the other point that I was going to mention about that I didn't mention is because human life is looked at as not ownership. You can't own a life, you can't own a person. There are slight exceptions to this when it comes to slavery and stuff like that. What does Torah law say? But I don't want to get into that. But generally, human beings are not ownable, not by ourselves. We're in charge of our lives. We can make decisions for ourselves, but we can't own a person. We don't have rights over our bodies. God owns our bodies. And we consider them, it's a loan from God. Your body is a loan from God. As opposed to your possessions, you do own. So if you want to burn down your house, in theory, you can. It is considered what we call wastage. So our animals are actually considered our property. Our animals, from a Jewish perspective, is considered our property, just like our money is, just like our wooden trees outside are. And we're allowed to destroy things, although you shouldn't do wasting. If it's going to be wasting, there's a separate law of Baal Tashkis. But when it comes to human life, that we have no ownership over, and therefore it's not in our domain, not our lives, certainly not somebody else's. And therefore, we have no right not to commit, not to end our own lives or to end somebody else's life, because that's just not in our hands. It's not something that we have ownership over from a Jewish perspective. Okay, that was the point that I was hoping to get back to. Okay. All right. Thank you very much. Thanks for joining. We'll think of something good next week. We might talk about cremation, but we'll let me know.
Come back to this.
Sorry.
Come back to this topic as well.
Come back to this topic.
this topic.
Yes.
Part 2 on this
So
topic.
much more to do. Yeah, so much more.
Yeah. Okay. You know what? I'll have a look at it. And there was a lot more that I wanted to do on this topic that I didn't do. And either we'll revisit it, or we can also go. There's a few on this topic. There's cremation, and then there's of course organ donation, and all these topics. By the way, I'm just doing we're not getting into anything heavy in the shir. Once we get proper back into person, I'm hoping to do JLI courses where we go through proper text and much more text. We move a lot faster through stuff and we cover a lot more material in a lot shorter amount of space, because the way they, in our shir, we go through a lot more back and forth, a lot of questions. But once we start doing JLI subjects as well, we'll still have to find a way to keep these shirim. But when you do that, then we probably would have maybe a little bit less discussion and more information driven. But when we get there, we'll discuss it. So we can still touch this subject. We may do a part 2 on the subject, or go into organ donation or cremation. Okay. And if you have any other topics that you'd like you to discuss, I'm happy to try to. I'm always looking for good topics.
Can I lift the mood? It's been a heavy topic.
Please do.
Well, I read a book about euthanasia. It was so good I couldn't put it down.
Oh,
Thank you.
no.
Okay.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you,
Thanks,
Rabbi.
Rabbi.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Noah. Thank you, Yochanan. Have a good night.
Thank
Good
you.
night.
Good night. Night, Tom.
Bye.